Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are putting on our analytical goggles and strapping into what you might call an intellectual time machine.
Right.
But I want to be perfectly clear right from the start. We are not here for history. We're not doing a nostalgia trip.
No, absolutely not.
And we are certainly not here to pass any kind of moral judgment on the past. Our mission today is, well, it's purely analytical, almost forensic.
That's the perfect word for it.
We're opening up the archive issues of The New Yorker from the entirety of 1942 a year, just defined by the sudden, immediate existential shock. And we're going to use that year as a kind of structural stress test for our own institutions as we look ahead toward 2026.
That's the key distinction. We are treating 1942 as a massive, real-world laboratory experiment. The whole objective is to filter out the personalities, the daily battles, the individual wartime stories.
Yeah, the human interest stuff.
Exactly. We're focusing solely on how institutions, and that's everything from the military to Madison Avenue, right down to local government, how they adapted or failed or, and this is the most interesting part, how they created these perverse incentives when they were faced with this sudden demand for total mobilization.
So what does a time of maximum structural pressure tell us about power dynamics and decision-making today?
That's the question.
Our sources for this give us a truly unique window. I mean, they span the immediate shock right after Pearl Harbor all the way through the intense buildup for the invasion of North Africa. We've got material covering the incredible granularity of military organization, the sudden implementation of rationing systems, the sheer absurdity of high-end consumption coexisting with wartime material shortages.
The cognitive dissonance is just staggering.
It is. And the cultural commentary of a population just trying to make sense of a world that is changing, radically day by day. It is, frankly, it's a goldmine for understanding the structural causes of that dissonance during a crisis.
So, with that in mind, our deep dive has 5 clear analytical objectives. We're going to analyze the institutional structure of that year. First, we need to establish what was deemed important, what was prioritized in the public narrative, and just as importantly, what was structurally ignored or just relegated to a side note.
Right. What gets the headline versus what gets buried on page 40.
Exactly. Second, we have to dissect the institutional incentives, the profit motives, the political necessities, the organizational rules that shaped these wartime narratives and ultimately determined who was asked to sacrifice and who was not.
Third, and this is where it really comes alive for you, the listener, we're going to analyze where the exact structural logic of 1942 is repeating today, especially as we stress test our current systems against, scenarios for 2026 geopolitical instability, climate shock, massive technological disruption.
And fourth, we'll extract the clearest institutional lessons we can possibly draw for the present moment. And then finally, we will try to identify the systemic blind spots of the 1942 era, the things they literally could not see because of the frame they were operating in.
And use that knowledge to maybe, just maybe, seek out our own blind spots today.
That's the mission.
Okay, let's jump straight into the data. The priorities of the day. What immediately, and I mean this, what just slaps you in the face when you read those 1942 issues, is the sheer, overwhelming volume of detailed, granular reporting on the military effort.
It's an obsession.
It is an absolute fixation on the micro detail of the fight.
And that fixation, it serves a really profound institutional and psychological function. You have to see it as a necessary stimulus for a large, deeply anxious public. Think about the reports the sources reveal. You read about Polish pilots returning to their loft like pigeons circling and swooping down.
It's so poetic.
It is. Or the terrifyingly intense, almost cinematic account of an RAF raid, like the description they give of the film Target for Tonight. It puts you right there in the cockpit.
It provides these hyper-specific, visceral points of connection to what is otherwise a massive, abstract global conflict. The war is everywhere, but it's just too big to grasp. So by giving you the individual story of the Polish pigeon pilots or the fear inside that RAF cockpit,
it makes the distant horror immediate.
Yes, and manageable. It gives it a face and a setting you can anchor all that free-floating anxiety to.
And this granularity is also where we find some really crucial lessons about competence and institutional scale. You just have to look at the description of U.S. Navy submarine life in the sources.
Oh, that was fascinating.
The narrator notes that on a submarine, all 30 must be thoroughly dependable. That small, confined, incredibly high-stakes environment creates an immediate, localized, and urgent incentive structure for peak competence. Respect is absolutely mandatory because failure is immediately fatal to the entire team.
Failure has instant, localized consequences. There's no escaping it. It's an incredibly effective organizational design for performance. It forces mutual respect. It forces dependency.
Now, contrast that tight institutional structure with the description of life on a larger scale, say a destroyer, which the sailors, they called it can.
A can, right?
A man might be assigned to a job below deck and genuinely never see action at all, even during a major engagement. The sense of purpose, and therefore the incentive for peak performance and vigilance, it's immediately diluted by the scale of the operation.
So the stakes feel lower for the individual.
Much lower. In 1942, they learned very quickly that scale kills specific motivation. And in 2026, we see this repeating in massive complex institutions all the time. The closer you are to the local consequence, the higher the performance incentive.
And even the political critiques from that time were funneled through this very centralized institutional lens. The sources, they note the dismissal of Churchill's failures in the Far East, huge geopolitical setbacks. But the proposed fix is always framed as a problem that can be solved by Washington conversations.
Right, as if a few powerful men in a room can just fix it.
It suggests this persistent, almost childlike faith in central international fixers to solve what were actually deep, dispersed structural collapses in colonial and military power. They couldn't yet grasp that the problem wasn't a failure of executive competence, but the actual crumbling of entire global systems.
And what's so structurally fascinating is how this dominant institutional stimulus, this urgent, anxiety-fueled demand for war information, coexists with the dominant commercial stimulus, relentless profit-seeking through high-end consumption.
It's a bizarre mashup.
It is. The New Yorker's audience was wealthy, and the magazine's survival depended entirely on keeping that audience reading and, crucially, shopping.
This created a significant structural gap that I think really defines the era. The affluent were given this implicit institutional permission to define their war effort as, well, continuous consumption, maybe slightly inconvenienced, paired with these periodic shows of patriotism.
We see Brooks Brothers still advertising white buckskin shoes for up to $13 and black calfskin shoes for up to $16.50.
And the shirts, this detail always gets me, they're advertising shirts for an astounding $70.
You have to remember what $70 represented in 1942. It was a staggering sum of money. It indicates that even in the face of total war and rationing, the commercial ecosystem supporting the wealthy was not only surviving, but in many ways it was thriving.
And it went way beyond clothing.
Oh, absolutely. You still see heavy marketing for expensive perfumes like Chanel Glamour, Coty's Airspun face powder, and Dorothy Gray's high-end skincare lines. These products are fundamentally unnecessary to the war effort.
You could say that again.
Yet they are the absolute backbone of the magazine's financial structure.
It's the institutionalization of cognitive dissonance. It's okay. The war is happening, materials are scarce, men are dying. But the structure of daily life for the magazine's core audience is defined by minimizing their inconvenience.
And that's where the real estate ads come in.
Yes. Luxury apartment buildings like 399 Park Avenue advertise 6 or 8 room suites, promising substantially reduced rents for occupancy through October 1st, but still offering impeccably serviced living.
They're literally outsourcing their domestic anxiety to the impeccable service so they can free up their minds to focus on the global anxiety of the war. It's a coping mechanism.
So the war effort for this demographic is implicitly managed by these easy transactional shows of patriotism like buying war savings bonds. $18.75 for a $25 bond. It's a manageable financial transaction.
Not a genuine disruption of their high-end lifestyle. And this duality, the structural gap, is so essential because, as we're about to see, it breeds this intense structural resentment among the majority who are asked for real, tangible sacrifice.
So if that's what was being prioritized, this granular military detail on one hand and the continuity of luxury on the other, then what systemic realities were being overlooked in favor of all this social and commercial commentary?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the magazine's institutional focus on New York society and the immediate military drama meant that a huge, messy, complex reality, which was the logistical and bureaucratic breakdown of mobilization, was largely ignored.
Or worse.
Or worse, treated as a funny anecdote.
Right. The sources give us this incredibly telling anecdote about the logistical chaos at Fort Bragg. And this isn't a small problem. 1,200 infantry replacements arrived completely unexpected.
Just showed up.
They just showed up. The military bureaucracy, which was supposed to be this finely tuned machine, failed entirely to communicate their movement. And the magazine, in its very wry, sort of detached tone, noted that the military had, quote, evidently forgetting in its haste to leave the butler a note about our arrival.
That is profound. A massive, centralized institution, the U.S. Army, is failing at the most basic job of moving people from point A to point B. If they can't coordinate a simple rail shipment of 1,200 men, what does that tell you about the structural integrity of the rest of this colossal war machine?
And why did they treat it like a joke?
And crucially, why did the New Yorker treat this colossal bureaucratic blunder as a minor society page anecdote?
Because it was too difficult to process. It's too big. The magazine often focused its critique on things that were manageable, like the social effects of war or, executive competence.
Exactly. Like the debate over whether Mayor LaGuardia should step down from the Office of Civilian Defense
Yeah.
because the job, and I'm quoting here, interferes with his life work of being mayor of New York.
That's a fight you can understand.
That debate over LaGuardia is a small, local, political argument you can win or lose. The real failure, the industrial, the infrastructural failure of Fort Bragg, or the insane complexity of tool production, like Boeing needing 200,000 special tools for their triple fret press.
That's too much.
That was too systemic, too messy, and frankly too distant from Park Avenue to hold their sustained analytical attention. And that's a classic institutional blind spot. You prioritize the debate you can manage or the executive you can criticize over the fundamental grinding infrastructural problems that require a total systemic overhaul.
They prioritized the politics of image over the logistics of reality. And that structural choice ensured they completely missed the real story of American mobilization.
And this structural divide, this gap between centralized policy and messy localized reality, is perfectly stress-tested when the government attempted to implement mass resource allocation through the rationing system. The local ration board became the point of maximum institutional friction.
It's where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it exposed all the limits of central command authority.
The source material gives us this wonderfully vivid, almost absurd look inside the White Plains ration board. They had to deal with the overwhelming chaos of gas, tires, and sugar rationing all at once.
And where was it housed?
In 2 dusty rooms in an old high school gym. I mean, the sheer volume was impossible. They were handling a couple hundred people in 2 hours.
This is such a crucial institutional lesson for 2026. Centralized command authority, the policy that originates in Washington, D.C., it so frequently meets chaotic, under-resourced, and poorly coordinated local execution.
It's a universal problem.
It is. The system couldn't function based on clearly written policy alone. It had to rely heavily on the improvised, peculiarly American behavior of the board members, who were mostly volunteers or underpaid staff, to resolve confusion, manage exceptions, and essentially become the policy themselves, right there on the fly.
It's the huge gap between the beautifully written mandate and the ugly reality of implementation. And the implementation itself immediately generated opportunistic behavior. When gas rationing was announced suddenly, what did people do?
They rushed the pumps.
They rushed the pumps to top off their tanks. One operator is quoted saying, "Never sold so much gas in my life."
And this is vital, because it demonstrates the immediate incentive problem created by sudden policy changes based on scarcity. When central policy creates sudden scarcity, the immediate incentive for any rational individual is to acquire as much of that vanishing resource as possible, often before the policy even takes effect.
Human nature.
Exactly. This opportunistic behavior immediately worsens the short-term crisis, in this case, draining the local gas supply instead of promoting immediate, smooth compliance. Any policy design has to account for the reality that scarcity incentivizes preemption.
And that failure of implementation leads directly to the most destructive institutional stimulus you can have during any crisis, the perception of unequal sacrifice.
It just violently undermines social cohesion and institutional legitimacy.
We have to be really cold and analytical here. The most damaging force to any mass mobilization effort is the wealthy minority opting out of the shared sacrifice.
And the sources provide these stinging examples of this inequality driving deep, deep resentment. The majority of people accepted the economical skimpiness of service and civilian utility clothing. It was a necessary wartime adjustment to material shortages.
They were on board with it.
They were. But, the source says, they were reasonably resentful that the wealthiest segment of society could still order clothes regulated by nothing but the depth of their pocketbooks.
It's a structural break. The government's call for total war and a shared national destiny, it just rings hollow when the rich can simply shop their way out of the rationing inconvenience.
And this structural failure to enforce equal sacrifice, was magnified by the black market, which was explicitly tied to high-end consumption. The source notes the wealthy's continued ability to order these expensive restaurant meals that were maintained by backdoor dickerings.
I mean, even during total war, they needed the backdoor dickers. The level of entitlement there is just, it's truly staggering.
The institutional failure isn't just that rationing was confusing, it's that the state failed, either through policy or through enforcement, to create a genuinely level playing field for this communal effort.
And that break, that structural break between the rhetoric of total sacrifice and the reality of private privilege, it creates a cynicism that institutionalizes itself and it outlives the crisis. It has long-term consequences.
So, if the institution of rationing failed by relying on local goodwill and personal sacrifice, we find a profoundly different and maybe more calculated institutional lesson when we look at corporate behavior. This brings us to the very surprising case of Alcoa.
Okay, this is perhaps the coldest, most cynical, and therefore most useful institutional lesson in the entire archive. Alcoa, a major aluminum producer, found itself in a period of intense, unprecedented demand during the war. They were essentially operating as a monopoly.
You'd expect, based on classical self-interest, that they would extract maximum profit, right? I mean, the government had to buy their product, but they didn't.
They didn't. The sources note that Alcoa limited production and kept its prices moderate.
So why? Was it patriotism? The source explicitly concludes that this wasn't some archangelic patriotic behavior, but that their policy was dictated by a wholesome fear of the penalties of the Sherman Act.
The threat of regulation, the looming power of antitrust enforcement acted as this powerful structural incentive for fair play, even when the market was effectively monopolistic because of the crisis demand.
This is a foundational insight. The state's latent power to regulate market structures proved to be a more reliable incentive for compliance than any appeals to corporate patriotism or morality.
Think about that for a minute.
The system worked, not because the people running Alcoa were necessarily good people, but because they knew the moment the war ended, they would be subject to a harsh regulatory review. They could have their company broken up if they were seen to have exploited the national crisis.
It was long-term self-interest.
Exactly. That fear, that structural check on their power, moderated their self-interest in real time.
That is such a direct lesson for 2026. In any future crisis where resource scarcity or a technological monopoly, digital or material, creates high demand, the latent threat of aggressive antitrust enforcement or regulation is a necessary structural moderator of corporate self-interest.
It proves that the government's ability to shape the rules of the game is absolutely essential, especially when we can least afford a market failure. So moving from these internal structures, we really need to analyze their external awareness. What were the profound systemic blind spots in the New Yorker's 1942 coverage? And these were largely driven by the magazine's institutional focus on the North Atlantic axis and, immediate events.
Right. The entire analytical framework was built around executive competence in London and Washington, and immediate results on the Russian front or in the Atlantic. And while they did critique British preparations in the Far East, the core narrative really struggled to integrate the irreversible structural geopolitical shifts that were happening in the Pacific.
They treated the Japanese advances and the collapse of colonial rule, the actual end of the European empires, not as a systemic conclusion, but as a temporary military setback.
Something to be reversed.
Something to be reversed after Hitler was defeated. They completely failed to grasp the scale of the permanent shift that was underway in global power centers and structures.
And we see this high-level, long-term systemic thought, it gets relegated to the periphery of the magazine. A book review, for instance, mentions the complex potential of places like the Netherlands Indies. It discusses the local peoples, the immense resources, the need for a post-war free trade federation.
But it's in the book review section.
Exactly. This crucial, forward-looking geopolitical analysis remains tucked away in the back, far from the core political and military commentary up front.
And that's a structural error in information consumption. Because the mainstream narrative was so focused on the familiar power axis London and Washington. Anything that suggested an irreversible, non-European dominated future was mentally compartmentalized. It was marginalized. Their institutional frame literally prevented them from seeing the end of the colonial world and the rise of the post-war order.
We also find a sort of meta-institutional blind spot concerning the media itself, specifically the powerful stimulus of self-promotion, which I have to say mirrors today's influencer economy perfectly.
Oh, it's a direct line.
This is exemplified by the editor Ralph Ingersoll, who quit the Time organization.
Ingersoll was an editor making $45,000 a year, which is an immense, immense salary in 1942, and yet the source says he felt practically unknown.
It's unbelievable.
This feeling of anonymity drove him to start his own paper, PM, where he then went to these incredible lengths to brand himself. He wrote articles that were signed at both ends and frequently featured pictures of himself in exotic locations.
Like on top of a dromedary.
Atop a dromedary or at the Kremlin.
You're kidding me. 45,000 a year and he still felt unknown. That level of ego and that need for visible self-branding is truly a constant.
It is.
It shows a real structural weakness in the journalistic institution. When the framework of the press fails to provide sufficient visible recognition or celebrity, it incentivizes the elevation of personality and spectacle over substantive journalism.
Exactly. Ingersoll needed to be, quote, one of the least anonymous editors in the world. His drive wasn't journalistic success, it was personal visibility. And this structural need for self-branding overrides the traditional journalistic focus on the story itself, and it paves the way for today's sensationalist, personality-driven media economy, where the messenger often matters more than the message.
This brings us to a really crucial analytical step, identifying what the people and institutions of 1942 treated as a temporary necessity, a wartime fix, but which rapidly became a permanent structural feature of modern life.
The most visible, immediate example of this is the normalization of functional clothing, particularly for women, and it was driven entirely by pragmatic necessity.
Not by fashion.
Not at all. Wartime material shortages and, crucially, fuel rationing forced people to keep their city apartments cold. The source specifically noted that 65 degrees is a bit chilly.
Necessity is truly the mother of invention, or at least the destroyer of social norms. Because of this need for warmth, stores like Best started pushing slacks, not for outdoor streetwear that was still socially fraught, but specifically for lounging in city apartments.
And we see descriptions of tartan slacks for $10.95 or flannel slacks paired with rayon sharkskin blouses.
And this rapid normalization of casual utility-based wear was a necessity driven by crisis, a temporary solution to a cold apartment problem. But it structurally shifted these gendered social norms around professional and home attire. It permanently accelerated the acceptance of slacks and utility garments for women after the war.
The formal ballet-length dress just vanished.
Gone. Replaced by longer, more covering styles that adapted to the need for utility. The temporary fix became the permanent cultural structure.
And we see a similar, though maybe more conflicted, shift in the institutional role of women, particularly volunteers, during the war.
Yeah. The language used in the sources is highly conflicted. It mentions light-headed women doing volunteer work because it's fashionable, and then it contrasts them with determined women who are spending a great deal of time in acquiring discipline and special training.
So the institutional power structure clearly viewed their participation as temporary and conditional. The source points out the privilege of these volunteers. They could quit at any time without being shot for desertion.
Wow.
This highlights the persistent gendered structural hierarchy. Men were coerced into the effort. Women were invited as temporary help.
However, the critical long-term outcome is the institutionalizing of that special training and discipline in these new spheres. Even if the women were volunteers in the motor corps or civilian defense, the establishment of formal institutionalized training and standards set a powerful precedent for structural inclusion in traditionally male-dominated logistical and organizational roles.
So the temporary purpose supporting the war effort created a permanent structure.
A permanent structure, formal training pathways, and recognized skill sets that lasted far beyond 1945. The institution of formal training proved its utility regardless of who was taking the course, and that structural change was impossible to reverse once the war ended. Now we get to the core of the stress test. How is the logic of 1942 repeating itself structurally today as we look toward 2026?
Well, the first major repetition is the structural challenge of information management in a time of anxiety. The 1942 sources critiqued what they called the decline of good sense in contemporary literature, arguing that complexity and anxiety structurally push media toward the eccentric.
And in 1942, they struggled with information scarcity. They were relying on these skimpy BBC bulletins, or they needed a shortwave radio with a wave magnet to get the full story. Today, in 2026, we have the exact opposite problem: unprecedented information overload.
But the structural tendency remains identical. When complexity is high, uncertainty is pervasive, and anxiety is widespread, the public and the media structures tend to bypass slow, rational, evidence-based analysis in favor of the hyper-eccentric, the sensational, or the personalized narrative.
It's the same outcome from opposite problems.
Exactly. The search for good sense is structurally abandoned for narratives that provide immediate emotional stimulus, whether that stimulus comes from scarcity or overwhelming abundance. Both lead to the same structural demand for the sensational.
Secondly, we see the identical structural bargain when it comes to the governance of uncertainty. There's an apartment advertisement from 1942 that explicitly stated this core bargain. It said, "There is one uncertainty you can prevent: wind and weather, and what the morrow will bring. These must remain uncertain. But you can free your mind of the problem of where to live this fall."
That is the structural deal the institutions of affluence offer during a crisis. It's so clear. You outsource the manageable, localized anxieties, where to live, how to get domestic service, how to handle basic logistics, to these large, impeccably serviced institutions, like the full-service apartment building.
And this convenience economy frees up your mental capacity, your emotional bandwidth to focus on the truly unmanageable existential risks of the era.
Like global war then, or today, geopolitical instability and climate change.
This structural repetition is absolutely everywhere in 2026. Modern institutions, from subscription services to automated finance, from instant grocery delivery to managed healthcare, they encourage us to outsource our immediate, localized chaos, precisely so we can focus our dwindling cognitive resources on the overwhelming systemic threats that no single institution can fully solve.
The 1942 institution of the impeccably serviced Park Avenue suite is the direct structural predecessor to today's institutionalized convenience economy, which is designed to manage localized chaos for the privileged.
And finally, let's go back to the military structure, because it provides a profound lesson in organizational design for resilience. You have to contrast the chaos of the unexpected Fort Bragg replacements with the elite Commando training regimen described in the sources.
It's night and day.
The Commando regiment is defined by this radical decentralization and performance-based trust. Men were dismissed in the afternoon and told to report 30 miles away the next morning with no further explanation.
And nobody cares how he gets there. They are expected to manage their own process, their own logistics.
And crucially, the discipline was enforced not by rigid coercion or immediate punishment, but by a positive incentive structure.
Right, the men were treated well in private lodgings, where the householders had no compulsion to keep them if they misbehaved. So the incentive was performance-based trust and the comfort derived from local goodwill, not central rigid control. If they failed to perform, the punishment was the loss of the privilege of comfort.
This suggests a really powerful lesson for institutional resilience in 2026. Effective, modern institutions thrive on setting clear, high-stakes outcomes while granting individual autonomy on the process.
Decentralized travel and expected self-management, backed by positive incentives like trust and comfort, rather than just negative coercion, yields superior results compared to the rigid but chaotically managed centralized logistics structure that we saw with the Fort Bragg failure. So we synthesize our analysis of 1942. 3 key institutional lessons emerge that are immediately applicable to managing systemic risk and maintaining social coherence in 2026.
Okay, lesson number 1. The sources prove that structural inequality seen in the black markets, the luxury consumption, the loophole exploitation, it immediately corroded the legitimacy of mass mobilization efforts. Public compliance is directly proportional to the perceived fairness of the burden sharing.
So institutions in 2026, government, corporations, media, they must prioritize fairness of burden sharing above all else, especially when they're demanding collective effort to tackle massive risks. If you allow systems of private privilege to flourish while demanding sacrifice from the majority, you guarantee long-term systemic cynicism and non-compliance.
And it makes future mobilization efforts politically impossible.
Completely.
Lesson 2. The Commando example provides the structural blueprint for organizational resilience. When you decentralize command and responsibility, the motivation has to shift fundamentally from central coercion to local trust and performance-based incentives.
Motivation derived from non-coercive incentives, like trust, comfort, and local goodwill, is simply more resilient and produces superior results than rigid, chaotic central management. This lesson is critical for designing efficient, responsive distributed workforces, resilient supply chain networks, and flexible governance models, especially during periods of high shock.
And the third lesson. The revelation that Alcoa was moderated by the wholesome fear of the penalties of the Sherman Act is our cold, calculated insight into power dynamics.
It demonstrates that the state's latent power to regulate market structures is a more reliable incentive for fair play during times of high demand or low competition than merely trusting corporate self-interest or public appeals to patriotism.
In 2026, where digital and material monopolies wield this immense concentrated power, the latent threat of aggressive antitrust enforcement serves as a necessary structural moderator of corporate self-interest.
It ensures that critical resources and services are distributed fairly during a crisis, preventing the very structural inequality that poisoned the 1942 civilian effort.
We've spent this deep dive in 1942. We saw a world where luxury consumption and existential survival coexisted very uneasily, a society governed by overwhelmed local institutions, conflicted narratives, and this persistent structural demand for convenience.
The profound takeaway from the 1942 sources is the systemic blind spot they exhibited regarding the sheer scale of the change that was happening. They processed the global conflict as a temporary disruption to be managed, a problem to be solved so New York society could get back to normal.
Right, back to normal.
Overlooking the fact that this stress was creating permanent structural shifts in geopolitical power, in technology, and in the social fabric of the home.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. What the 1942 magazine struggled to see was how quickly the temporary fix slacks for warmth, the institutionalization of women's training, the massive federal bureaucracy of resource management would become the permanent defining structure of modern life.
They thought they were building temporary scaffolding.
Exactly. They thought it was scaffolding. They're actually building the new foundation of the 21st century.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Consider the account of the Norwegian merchant seaman mentioned in the sources, right after Pearl Harbor. He said he felt more natural to be a belligerent on a belligerent ship than that anomalous creature, a neutral among belligerent friends.
That sentiment, that neutrality, whether it's social, economic, or political, is an anomalous creature that cannot survive a fundamental structural realignment. That is the deepest institutional lesson of 1942. The old structures were just gone, and the choice to participate in the new alignment was unavoidable.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, today?
What systemic shift are we collectively treating as merely temporary? A disruption to be endured until we can get back to normal that will, in fact, define the permanent constraints and structures of 2036.
And what institutional or social habit are you still trying to be neutral about that 1942 suggests you must choose a side on now because the realignment has already happened? The new permanent structure might already be here, and we just haven't stopped calling it a temporary fix yet.